1944. The Second World War is at its most brutal peak. Across every island in the Pacific, American Marines and Japanese forces are locked in bloody, relentless combat. The Japanese military has something terrifying: an elite team of code breakers who can shatter almost any American encryption. Every secret message, every battle plan, intercepted. But then, everything changed. America deployed a weapon unlike anything ever seen in the history of warfare. It wasn't forged in a factory. It wasn't invented in a laboratory. It didn't fire bullets or drop bombs. It was a language, an ancient language spoken by a people who had lived on this land for thousands of years. This is the story of the Navajo Code Talkers, the warriors whose ancestral tongue became the most powerful cryptographic weapon in military history, and whose story the world wasn't allowed to know for over 2 decades. In any war, information is power. Knowing where the enemy will strike, how many forces they're moving, and when the attack begins, that knowledge decides who wins and who dies. Throughout World War II, the United States military transmitted battle orders using complex encryption systems, codes designed to be unbreakable. But Japan had assembled one of the most brilliant code-breaking units in history. Their analysts were fluent in English. They understood American military structure, and they were cracking American codes almost at will. Attack positions, supply routes, troop movements. The Japanese knew. Before the assault even began, they were ready. American generals were facing a crisis. Their communications were compromised. Their strategies were exposed. And no encryption system they built could stay secret long enough to matter something. Something had to change. Then, an unlikely civilian walked into a Marine Corps office with an idea so unusual, so audacious, that the officers in the room almost laughed him out the door. Almost. This is the story of the Navajo Code Talkers, the warriors whose ancestral tongue became the most powerful cryptographic weapon in military history, and whose story the world wasn't allowed to know for over 2 decades.
Philip Johnston was a civil engineer, not a soldier, not a cryptographer, not a military strategist. But he had something no one else in that building had: a childhood spent living among the Navajo people. His father was a missionary on the Navajo Nation reservation. Philip grew up playing with Navajo children, hearing their language spoken every day, learning its rhythms, its sounds, its extraordinary complexity. By the time he was an adult, he was one of fewer than 30 non-Navajo people on Earth who could speak it fluently. In early 1942, he walked into the Marine Corps headquarters in San Diego with a proposal. He said, use the Navajo language as a battlefield communication code. The officers were skeptical. They'd tried using Native American languages in World War I with limited results. But Johnston pressed on. He explained, the Navajo language has no written form. It has no dictionary. Its tonal structure means a single shift in pitch can completely change a word's meaning. A trained linguist would need years, possibly decades, to master it. And as of 1942, not a single Japanese intelligence officer had any meaningful exposure to it. The Marine Corps agreed to a test. The results stunned them. A message that took a mechanical encryption machine 30 minutes to encode and decode took the Navajo speakers 20 seconds. The program was approved immediately.
To understand why the Navajo language was so effective, you have to understand why it's so extraordinary. First, it is a tonal language. The same word spoken with a different pitch means something completely different. These distinctions are near impossible to detect without years of immersion. Second, Navajo grammar is unlike almost any language on Earth. Verb forms shift based on incredibly specific categories: the shape of objects, their movement, their relationship to space. A single Navajo verb can carry the meaning of an entire English sentence. Third, it was, at that moment in history, essentially unknown outside the American Southwest. There were no textbooks, no recordings, no intelligence files, nothing for Japan to study, analyze, or reverse engineer. Navajo was not just a language. It was a naturally occurring cipher, one that had taken thousands of years to develop and could not be replicated or decoded in any time frame useful to a wartime enemy. 29 young Navajo men were recruited as the first Code Talker unit. Their mission? Develop a military vocabulary of 411 words, translating modern warfare into the natural imagery of the Navajo world.
The code these men created was a work of remarkable ingenuity. Modern military equipment had no Navajo equivalent, so the Code Talkers drew from the natural world around them. Aircraft were named after birds. A dive bomber became guinea, the Navajo word for chicken hawk, the bird that plunges from the sky. A fighter plane was da-he-ti-he, the hummingbird, fast and darting. A bomber was jay-sho, the buzzard, large and slow-moving. Ships took the names of sea creatures. A battleship was lotso, the whale. A submarine was beishlo, the iron fish. A destroyer was kalo, the shark. For spelling out names and places, each letter of the English alphabet was assigned a Navajo word. The letter A became wolachi, ant. B was shush, bear. C was mawasi, cat. A Japanese intercept officer listening to these transmissions heard what sounded like no human language they had ever encountered. Some believed it might be a random signal, equipment malfunction perhaps. It was neither. It was the sound of an ancient people protecting a nation that had not always protected them.
Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Saipan, Iwo Jima. On every major Pacific battlefront, Navajo Code Talkers were there, crouched in foxholes, running through fire, transmitting life or death intelligence in real time. Where conventional encryption took 30 minutes, the Code Talkers took 20 seconds. In combat, that difference wasn't measured in time. It was measured in lives. They always worked in pairs, one to transmit, one to receive and confirm. Through monsoon rain and jungle heat, under artillery fire and aerial bombardment, they kept the lines of communication alive. But the ultimate test came at Iwo Jima. In February 1945, American forces launched an assault on this small, heavily fortified volcanic island in the Pacific. The Japanese had turned Iwo Jima into a fortress, thousands of interconnected tunnels, hidden artillery positions, and a garrison of 21,000 soldiers ordered to fight to the last man. The battle lasted 36 brutal days. Nearly 7,000 American Marines were killed. The fighting was savage beyond description. And through it all, the Navajo Code Talkers never stopped transmitting. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer at Iwo Jima, had 6 Navajo Code Talkers working around the clock. When the island was finally secured,
the Navajo Code Talkers weren't alone. In the European theater, the United States Army deployed 14 members of the Comanche Nation in a parallel program. These warriors served with the 4th Infantry Division, and their first operational test came on the most dangerous day of the entire war. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As thousands of Allied soldiers poured onto the beaches of Normandy under withering German fire, the first coded message of the invasion was transmitted in the Comanche language. The Germans, who had broken or compromised nearly every other Allied communication system, had no idea what they were hearing. The language held. The landing succeeded. And the Comanche Code Talkers helped turn the tide in Europe, just as their Navajo brothers had done in the Pacific.
The war ended in 1945. The Code Talkers came home. And then they were told to be quiet. the United States military classified the entire Navajo Code Talker program. The reasoning was strategic. The code might be needed again in a future conflict. If its existence became public, enemies might begin studying the Navajo language before it was needed. So the men who had helped win the most devastating war in human history were ordered to silence. They could not tell their families. They could not speak at veterans events. They could not explain what they had done or why they had done it. For 23 years, they carried it alone. No medals, no recognition, no acknowledgement in the history books their children read in school. Just the memory of a radio in their hands, a code on their lips, and a war they helped end in silence. In 1968, the Navajo Code was finally declassified. For the first time in over 2 decades, the Code Talkers were allowed to speak. But full recognition took even longer. It wasn't until August 2001, 56 years after the end of World War II, that the United States Congress awarded the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. Many of them came to Washington in wheelchairs. Their hands were weathered. Their hair was white. But when those medals were placed around their necks, the look in their eyes was unmistakable. Not bitterness for the decades of silence, not anger for the recognition that came so late. Just quiet, unshakable pride. President George W. Bush stood before them and said, "Our nation is in your debt." 16 of the original 29 had already died before that day came. The Navajo Code Talkers teach us something that the history books often overlook. The weapon that changed the Pacific War wasn't manufactured in a weapons plant. It wasn't designed by scientists or strategists. It was carried in the memory of a people, passed down through generations around fires in the desert, spoken by grandparents to grandchildren, preserved in the rhythms of a culture that the United States government had spent decades trying to erase. The very language they tried to silence became the shield that protected them. There is a painful irony in that. Navajo children had been forced into government boarding schools where speaking their native language was forbidden. Their culture was systematically suppressed. And yet, when America needed something no enemy could break, they turned to that same culture, that same language, those same people. The Code Talkers answered the call anyway, without hesitation, without conditions. That is not just military history. That is a statement about human dignity, about the enduring power of identity, and about what it means to serve something larger than yourself, even when that something has not always served you. The Navajo Code Talkers, the quiet warriors whose words won the war. May their story never be forgotten.